Divinity Original Sin is a bit of a mixed bag for me since I initially bought it after watching Total Biscuit's coverage over a decade ago, and I ultimately bounced off of it and never returned. In spite of liking the concepts and the genre, there were just too many rough edges. Though it probably didn't help that I was trying to solo play a game that was designed from the ground up to be a two-player experience. Now, with all the attention being given to the Divinity franchise thanks to Larian's success with Baldur's Gate 3, and a friend who was willing to put up with my bad puns and derpiness on stream, a return to Rivellon was in order. And while some of the rough edges that put me off initially were still there, the definitive edition's polish and the fact that I had someone to bounce thoughts off of really helped it latch on a bit better for me. Now, I'm also going to say up front that this is a good enough game, but definitely not a 10 out of 10 must-play classic. You can still tell this was Larian's first proper cRPG, and they were trying to pioneer new ideas for the genre on top of that. So some things landed, others not so much, and really I would lean towards the second Divinity Original Sin if you're wanting more of that polish you're used to from Baldur's Gate 3. While this is better served as an exploration into Larian's roots in the genre, though considering it does go on sale quite often, it's still a pretty good bang for the buck even though it's not perfect. That said, there are also some differences between the initial release and the definitive edition that make a big difference, such as more voice-acted lines, a couple extra characters to recruit, a few more quests, and overall a bit more polish compared to the initial gameplay. That first one being especially important since it makes some of the more exposition-heavy sections much more relaxing to digest on stream instead of having to read everything out loud. And it is worth noting that exposition is one of the big reasons I bounced off of the game back in the day. Simply put, the game starts you out with a little bit of wandering and action, but drops you very quickly into the first town, which is several hours of talking to people, gathering lore, and then deciding which direction to run off to from there. This can be a bit much, especially since there's so many little quests and doodads to interact with in this space. You may even spend several gaming sessions without even leaving the town if you want to explore it in depth before going into the wilderness. And generally the game tends to stick with this pattern in each act, with a large quest-dense hub and exploration areas around it with a handful of quests of their own, with a good deal of lore and dialogue to keep track of and dig through, and a few dungeons to dive into. This is not helped by the fact that the quest journal leaves a bit to be desired, though that's a problem even in the second game and Baldur's Gate 3 to a lesser extent. Though this might be because I grew up on titles like Baldur's Gate and am used to more robust journal systems in general. Now, before diving into just what that story entails and spoiling it, I want to hit on the shining star of Divinity, and that is the mechanics, both for dialogue and for combat. The dialogue one is thankfully fairly simple, but introduced conflict resolution that weirdly has not been replicated directly, not even in Larian's later games, which is a shame since there are a few multiplayer titles that could be somewhat fun with it. Due to its nature as a two-player game from the ground up, it sets up the opportunity for players to disagree on topics, and actually go into a conflict resolution mode to decide whose action wins through a game of rock, paper, scissors, with more points being awarded to more charismatic characters in the discussions. So your low charisma character might only get 2 points towards the 10 for a win, while a high charisma character might get 5 or 6 per win, and whoever reaches that 10 first decides the direction the party will take. This is also expanded to charisma conflicts and persuasion checks with NPCs and enemies throughout the world, so it can have some opportunities to twist the game in slightly different directions, though admittedly not as drastic as in Larian's later games. Now, is it necessary to lean into this? No, since it generally has as much of an expansion on content as the ability to talk to animals with Pet Pal, which is just more context and a couple fun lines. All this ultimately culminates in an interesting personality test for your characters that gives you extra boons. Take a lot of actions that are considered pragmatic, and you'll get a boost to your crafting skill, which lets you use higher level recipes. If you instead lean to be more romantic, you get a boost to Lucky Charm, which in turn results in you finding more items in chests and such. Stay balanced between both of these and you get nothing though. While this doesn't give nearly as strong of a choices matter illusion as other cRPGs, it does at least make your actions have a mechanical and story repercussion, and even forces you to somewhat play towards a specific archetype of personality. And this in general makes the meat and potatoes of the dialogue experiences in the game feel a bit more interesting when you stumble across the conflict points, instead of just random roll or hard stat checks like most games implement. The combat mechanics on the flip side are actually a lot more complex and lean into more dynamic skill and stat systems as well. From the character building perspective, you're free to mix and match whatever you want instead of being limited to specific classes, despite there being suggested archetypes in the character creation. Do you want an archer that summons spiders? Pick up Marksman and Geomancer. Want a more paladin-themed character? Man-at-Arms and Hydrosophist might be more your speed. And there's countless even weirder combos that can beat the game, even if on higher difficulties you might be a little better off specializing on each character. I personally liked focusing a ton on intelligence for one of my characters, slapping him with dual wands and machine gunning enemies with the attacks and spells for a fairly decent effect, though it may have been a bit more effective if I had not spread my points quite so thin on the spell schools, which did limit my high-end skill access. Now, there is one thing I noticed about this while experimenting, and that's the game won't let you do basically a skillless playthrough. So you can't do the overly cliche D&D fighter that just attacks a lot without wasting at least a single point in a skill set. But you can get away with close to that with Man-at-Arms to simulate something more akin to the Battlemaster subclass. Now, due to level limitations, since there are no respawning grinding spots, you will only get so many skill points and stat points to spread amongst things, so staying at least a bit specialized can be handy either way. You want to be a mage? Focus on intelligence. If you want to be a fighter, focus on strength, archer, dexterity. Since not only do these improve the potency of your abilities, but also can reduce some of the action point costs of them. By splitting, you will tend to struggle a bit with action points in the later game, so that paladin build should probably focus on strength and just enough intelligence to use their healing skills, so they won't have to skimp out on the 3 support stats. Now, you might be wondering why I call them support stats. Basically, while strength, dexterity, and intelligence focus on potency of respective skills, action point costs of them, etc., you also have 3 other stats: constitution, speed, and perception, all of which influence your action points in different ways, and provide their own supporting buffs, but generally don't directly influence your skill potency itself. And frankly, I wish I had invested in these sooner in our playthrough, since a bit into it we ran across a few environmental effects that made it a nightmare due to effects like slow that robbed you of precious action points, making battles a slog. And while it was a cool concept to have rather imposing environmental effects just for the environment and theme of it, it definitely was one of the rough edges that hit me hard while causing some of the serious frustrations. This was especially saddening because the game's combat system is built around mixing and matching battlefield effects, so the balance being off was a bit irritating. Thankfully, they greatly improved it for the second game while keeping the fun parts of this one intact, with effects like throwing oil on the ground to set it on fire with a fireball, or creating puddles before throwing lightning so you can stun everyone in it, or even doing the same stun with steam clouds instead, with these and many more being cornerstones of the real depth of the combat. In the second game, they took this cool and enjoyable feature up to 11, while reducing the global environmental effects down to be more reasonable in the game environment, but it is still interesting to look at their early experiments in it, how it was broken at times in our favor as well as not so much in our favor. And despite now having nearly 100 hours into the game, I'm not entirely certain I fully explored all the potential combinations of environmental effects or tricks and power moves you can do, especially when combined with the ability to teleport people and objects around to make it more dynamic. And weirdly, despite not being a fan of tenebrium effects in the first part of this, I do find myself missing them in the second game, since I feel the bless and curse effect in it just doesn't quite hit the same way, though admittedly the time gap and general jank of implementation are probably both good reasons for not implementing this. Either way, by the end of the game, while we would rage at being crowd-controlled by enemies with the use of charm, slow, and even one ability that greatly reduced strength, stripping our tank of her weapon, the ability to set environmental traps, chaos, and just execute fun wow moments more than made up for it with the tools we had, and we eventually added these crazy combos to our bags. At one point, we even reenacted a moment that made us have to reload a boss fight due to a lucky meteor cluster, but instead used it against the enemies. Another thing to note, in a complex system like this, there are bound to end up being bugs, and these are just amplified as the game gets older and the systems it was originally designed to play on fade into the past. On modern Windows 10 and 11 systems, you're going to run across a number of bugs while playing, such as turn orders breaking in weird ways, effects sometimes going in unexpected ways, such as getting zapped by one pixel in a puddle while being missed while standing in the deep end, and rarely even breaking quests in weird ways, though that last one might just be me looking for loopholes. So if you are going to play it nowadays, it is perfectly doable. Just save frequently just in case, and especially before you go to cast healing on some targets, since that can sometimes make them hostile. And it is especially important to remember that teleport is an attack spell which can turn your allies against you, yes, even party members, so always teleport the main characters instead of the companions. That said, we never ran into anything that was insurmountable by just a quick reload or reconnect. Now, moving off of the mechanics, let's talk about the story. There's a lot there, but in spite of quests spanning multiple acts and zones, 4 potential companions to fill 2 slots, and their associated quests, you're generally going to be following that pattern I mentioned earlier. Even as early as the first act, you're dropped off on a shore like I said, and you make your way to the first town of Sicil, and you start talking to townsfolk, solving problems, and eventually getting your first MacGuffin stone. Whether that's a Bloodstone or Sunstone, it doesn't matter since it will start you down the same path, where you're basically going through the world in pursuit of some source issue, and also to deal with a bit of an issue with the end time and the void. Each act will generally drop you off in a similarly content-dense town, with several dozen quests, interesting characters, and events that will cause you to come and go from the town throughout the act. Again, using Sicil as an example. You'll solve everything from a bunch of unemployed sailors to find out about a guy that sunk a ship with his wife on it because he thought she was cheating on him. And a lot of these will lead you to learning more about your character's mysterious past and the connections to the end of time, as well as the mysterious illegal magic source we mentioned earlier. Which, yes, if you couldn't tell, source is different from magic, and sorcerers are different in this world, with them even poking fun at this. So don't be surprised that while the game actually dips its toes into some frankly dark and macabre topics while you're taking down its linear path, it's going to poke fun at itself, you, and the characters involved. I mean, at one point you literally fight a guy who uses 2 sewn together pigs as a bagpipe, and you help a magical well that is just the brother of the actual magical well. This all between dark stories of slavery, murder, suffering, the end of the world and time, your characters being tricked and sacrificed, and a plethora of other odd as hell things. I'm pretty sure that one thing is really just a cat that had a rougher life than you'd expect as well. It gets weird, and that helps distract from the fact that you are a lot less free than in other cRPGs with the story, since you will generally end up at the same ending unless you really try to bork things up or just don't do any side quests. Now, the side characters do introduce a little bit of flex to this, especially since the definitive edition added 2 more of them and some extra side quests and dialogue to go with it. For our playthrough, we went with the originals though. Jahan and Medora, with Jahan being essentially Astarion with half the charm and twice the psychopathic tendencies, and Medora being a southern belle with a big sword and equally big I fucked up syndrome. The other 2 are the main reason I'm tempted by a second playthrough, since the other 2, at least in the little bit I spent with them, felt a bit more approachable in their early quests, and really, if you don't like any of them, Lone Wolf is still a perfectly viable option thanks to talents focused on it. Now, as far as playing this solo versus with a second player, I think both are viable. I did try out the first act solo after playing with Gablin over on Twitch, and it does flow a bit better now that I know what to expect from early Larian games. Well, early Larian cRPGs. And while I don't think I'd probably finish it on my own since I already know what happens, it is a lot more approachable now that it was back in the day. I do still think, due to how the conversation mechanics work, a second player makes it much closer to the intended experience, and you also don't have to worry about romancing situations getting weird, since unlike Larian's later games, and heck, a lot of other cRPGs in general, this one does not dip its toes into the romance space just yet. In the end, this is definitely a game worth buying and trying on sale, even if it's not quite up to snuff with its second entry, much less Baldur's Gate 3. It shows how franchises evolve. It shows the foundations of what would eventually turn into one of the best turn-based cRPG combat systems out there with Divinity 2. And more importantly, shows that you don't need everything to be up close and in-nostril cinematically expressed, which is a lesson other mid and low-budget cRPGs like Successor 2 should probably learn, since it can still be easy enough to express the story like this in an enjoyable manner. Needless to say, I enjoyed it, even if it wasn't quite enough for a full second playthrough.